Welcome to the Plagues Project.
And Plagues many angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
There is what the Talmudic sages call a kasha gedola, a big question, in the Adam Sandler 2019 movie Uncut Gems. Now, in this film, Adam Sandler plays a hustling Diamond District jeweler, a Jewish Diamond District jeweler named Howie Ratner. And for much of the film, Howie Ratner is trying to do everything he can to pay back $100,000 to a loan shark who's coming after him and sending his goons after him. And this loan shark is basically stopping at nothing to try to get his money back. And Sandler is wheeling and dealing. He's got a ring scheme with rings on consignment. He's got sports betting schemes going. And he's also bought an Ethiopian, a gem from a sect of Ethiopian Jews that he's trying to sell for a very high markup. And he's trying to do all this to get $100,000 back to pay the loan shark. Now, about halfway through the film, when it seems like all hope is lost, he's kind of trying to rig some scheme at an auction house that falls apart, doesn't seem to have any recourse. He finally is able to sell this Ethiopian gem to Kevin Garnett, the former NBA All-Star. This movie's got a motley crew of personalities in it. And what he does in this drama, and this very effective drama, is he basically sells him this gem for $165,000, and it would seem to get Howie Ratner completely off the hook. He's got $100,000 to pay the loan shark. He's got a $65,000 profit. Everything is golden, coming up roses for him. He's fine. And what does Ratner's character do at this point? He takes the $165,000. He calls the loan shark and the loan shark's goons to come to his office. And while they're waiting in the lobby, at the very last moment, instead of giving them the money, he decides to pass it in a briefcase to his girlfriend out the window so that she can place a sports bet at a casino. And watching the film, you're rooting for Howie Ratner, as much of a hustler as he is. You're rooting for him, you identify with him, and then you say, why would he do this? Why would he finally have the $100,000 to pay this loan shark and a nice profit to boot, and then try to bet it all on a very long shot sports bet, not just any sports bet, but a very long shot bet? And why would he act out of against his own self-interest? He's out of the woods. He's good to go. He's totally in the clear, and he goes right back into the forest. And it's a frustrating moment, and it's a moment you find yourself asking, if you're not throwing something at the movie screen or the TV, you're asking yourself, why is he doing this? I was watching the film again recently, and of course had this question, as I think a lot of viewers do, and it started to echo another character who seems to be out of the woods, seems to finally have gotten what he wanted, and can't leave well enough alone, and has to try to double down and get more of what he needs, and ends up making things a lot worse for himself. That character is Pharaoh in the Exodus story. Pharaoh, as we know, has been enslaving the Israelites, and Moses and Aaron say, we come with a message from God that you should be letting them out to worship in the desert, letting these people go. And Pharaoh, of course, resists at the beginning, and then plagues start befalling him. The blood comes, frogs come, lice comes, all these plagues start befalling him. And in each plague, as we know, Pharaoh is pleading with Moses and Aaron for them to stop, and says he will then let the Israelites go and worship in the desert if only the plagues stop. Sure enough, Moses and Aaron prayed to God per Pharaoh's request, and the plagues relent. Each plague relents. Pharaoh, the second he seems out of the woods and let the Israelites go, no more plagues, his people can go on living in peace, he doubles back and he says, no, wait a second, that's not enough for me. It's not enough to have the plague stop. I need to keep my free slave labor as well. It's not enough to have $100,000 to pay loan sharks and $65,000 in profit. They seem to be doing pretty well. Pharaoh got hundreds of years of slave labor, the pharaohs did, and somehow that's not enough for them. The plague stopping is not enough. They need to go and get more. And there's a kind of pathology that I think each of these characters have, and that one character can sort of illuminate about the other, that we kind of understand now if we see it in multiple scenes and in multiple scenarios where each of these characters kind of has a pathology. And it's almost like you want to say they're addicted to the game, you want to say maybe they're just greedy, or they simply are, by definition, not ever happy with what they have if they have something, they automatically are going to want more. Their reach is always going to exceed what they already have. And I think that if you kind of look at these two characters almost in a kind of dialogue with one another, the psychology makes sense. Their way of thinking makes sense, even if we don't necessarily agree with it. Of course, if it explains the psychology, it does not explain the theology. As we all know from the Exodus story, Pharaoh is not alone in deciding not to let the Israelites go. God is hardening his heart. We learn in the text that God hardens his heart many times. And the famous theological question is, well, if God is hardening his heart, why is it Pharaoh's fault? Why is Pharaoh being taken to task for an act that he didn't really commit? He simply seems to be a vehicle for God wanting to free the Jews, free the Israelites in a spectacular manner. And every time Pharaoh wants to let the Israelites go, God hardens his heart. So where's the free will? If Pharaoh is an autonomous being, it makes sense that he would then be punished for it. But God is hardening his heart. Why is he being held to account? So a lot has been written, of course, about this question, about the implications philosophically that Pharaoh is not actually in control of his own actions. But one thing that I think is interesting is if you go back and look at the text, God is not hardening Pharaoh's heart throughout. In fact, the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh is hardening his own heart, the text tells us. It's only in the 6th plague, the plague of the skin affliction, we call it boils, it's more likely some kind of rash, that God hardens his heart. The first 5, he's doing it to himself. And after the 6th plague, there's always some mention of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, but the first 5, he's doing it to himself. So that begins to explain a little bit what's happening here, at least theologically. Pharaoh undertook his own act. He was stubborn. He decided not to let the Israelites go, the first 5 plagues. And after that, God said, okay, you've had your 5 chances. I'm going to harden your heart from here on out, and now you won't have a lot of free will. Okay, well, that explains the pivot. It explains why, or it explains that there was a pivot, but it doesn't explain why there was a pivot. What happened after 5? Why was this arbitrarily decided that he would no longer have a choice on whether to harden his heart? So the scholar Nachmanides, the 13th century Spanish Jewish commentator, has a very interesting observation, rather ingenious even. He notes right before it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart for the 6th plague, he notes that it says the Egyptian sorcerers, the Hartumim, are no longer there. That's what the text says, that they were, as we know, the first number of plagues, they're present, they replicate several of them, they replicate the blood, they sort of replicate the frogs, they have trouble with the lice, but they're there. They're in Pharaoh's presence trying to mimic the same miracles, or as they see it, magic tricks that Moses and Aaron are enacting. But by the time the 6th plague rolls around, the skin affliction, they're not there. The text tells us that they are too laid up. They're too weak to stand, and so they are not in Pharaoh's presence when the 6th, when Pharaoh's deliberating what to do about the 6th plague. And at that point, it then says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And Nachmanides points out, well, this is an odd juxtaposition. Why does Pharaoh's decision or God's decision to harden his heart have anything to do with the sorcerer standing there? What does one thing have to do with the other? And he says, well, because in the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh wasn't just hardening his own heart. He was listening to the sorcerers, the Hartumim. The Hartumim were basically whispering in Pharaoh's ear every time Pharaoh was about to say, well, this is pretty impressive. Let me get out of this in one piece and let the Israelites go. He listened to the Hartumim. He listened to the sorcerers who were saying, maybe not so fast. Slow your roll. These miracles aren't what they appear to be. And what Nachmanides is pointing out is that now that the Hartumim were not there anymore, God stepped in and hardened Pharaoh's heart. But until that point, the Hartumim were doing it. The sorcerers were hardening his heart. And what it essentially does is it makes Pharaoh's sin not just a sin of stubbornness or of kind of waffling, but they make it a sin of listening, of listening to the wrong people, of taking what is effectively bad counsel from these sorcerers who were telling him not to let the Israelites out, and he listened to them instead of listening to his own instinct, which was, let these people go. It's going to make things a lot easier for me and my nation. He listened to these sorcerers, and what Nachmanides points out is that that was his mistake, that maybe he should not have been listening to them. Now, another movie comes to mind when you're thinking about people in bad situations of their own making, because I'm always thinking about movies, and particularly this film, and that is the 1999 Paul Thomas Anderson's psychological drama, Magnolia. Some of you may have seen this film. It's a kind of epic story over 3 hours long about characters in various states of solitude and unhappiness in the San Fernando Valley, just north of Los Angeles. Really great range of stars in it. Jason Robards, in his last film role, is a dying man with a lot of regrets that he's kind of trying to process. Julianne Moore plays his much younger wife, who has her own regrets and her own guilt about actions that she's undertaken. Tom Cruise plays a bombastic motivational speaker who is Robards' estranged son. He's dealing with regrets and things that he's done that have now led him into a bad place. John C. Reilly plays a police officer who's struggling with his own demons and has gotten to a place he doesn't really want to be. And right in the middle of the film, this kind of centerpiece scene is they're all dealing with their own bad actions, their own, the way their own mistakes and misguided choices have led them to a place in life they don't want to be. Anderson has kind of a brilliant musical centerpiece moment. Amy Mann, who the singer-songwriter, some of you may know, who wrote and performed a lot of the songs in the film, has a track called Wise Up. And what Anderson does, rather surreally, in a psychological drama, he has each of the characters sing a fragment of the lyrics to the song Wise Up, and he cuts between them. And one of the lines in the chorus goes, "It's not going to stop until you wise up." And each of the characters kind of sings this lyric and reflects on how their own actions, their own bad choices have gotten them to this place, their own less than wise decision-making and listening to people telling them to make those decisions, somewhat less than wise people telling them that, has gotten them to this place. And I think there's a very interesting echo to Pharaoh, who was listening, in Nachmanides' reading at least, to the sorcerers telling him to make some bad choices. These characters are all doing that, and now they're reaping the consequences. They're reaping the plague-like effects as well. Now, I don't bring up Magnolia just out of the blue. It's a film that actually has its own plagues connection. Again, if you've seen this, you know this moment happens late in the film, and it's a quite striking one. A plague of frogs begins falling down and imposing itself on the characters in the movie. We learn about this when John C. Reilly's cop character is driving, and we see a great shot from below the windshield. A single giant frog, in all its bulbous and somewhat grotesque glory, falls right on his windshield, causing him to start and almost crash the car. And we then proceed to watch all the characters in the film have frogs descend on them, sometimes helping them, sometimes getting in the way, but kind of insinuating themselves into their lives. And it's actually interesting, it only seems to be falling on them. It doesn't seem to be falling on the entire San Fernando Valley, which seems like maybe a bit of a callback to the Exodus text, in which, as Pharaoh notes, please make these frogs stop and not fall on me and my people, suggesting that it's a bit of a local plague. Didn't fall everywhere. These frogs didn't come out of the, and infest everyone. They certainly didn't infest the Jews. And there's a bit of a callback to that. So these frogs are falling down, and there's been a lot written about Magnolia, perhaps almost as much written about Magnolia and this frogs moment as has been written about the frogs in the original Exodus. And there's many explanations of what this means and what Anderson is trying to say. But to me, when I think about what the frogs mean, I kind of hark back to one of my favorite stories about what was really happening with the frogs, and it's a midrash, a kind of piece of biblical folklore meant to illustrate a point. And that is the midrash that, as discussed in the Talmud, that it was actually one frog. It started out as one frog. In fact, there is a singular reference to a frog at one point in the text. And the Egyptians hit it, and it split into two frogs. And then they were panicked and angry, and they hit it. Those two frogs, they hit them, and then they multiplied into 4, and then 8, and exponentially it went. Now, this is a rather odd midrash, and it's not quite clear what it's coming to tell us. But there's a very interesting explanation from a 20th century scholar known as the Steipler Gaon, known as a rabbi named Kanievsky, who basically says that this midrash about hitting frogs and then having them multiply is not just about some supernatural notion that frogs multiply when you hit them. It's that the Egyptians were not being rational, and they were not being cool in their demeanor. In fact, they were being impulsive and listening to the wrong voices, and that was making their problems worse. They thought they could hit the frog and make it stop. 2 frogs emerged. They thought hitting them could make them stop. 4 frogs emerged, and they kept hitting them, not hearing the voice in their mind that's saying, well, maybe we should stop hitting frogs. Maybe maybe we should wise up and make things a little bit better for ourselves. We're not going to do that. We're going to keep hitting the frogs, and we are going to, in fact, they thought they were going to make it better, but because they were not wising up, they were making things worse. And so I thought that explanation kind of squares very nicely with the theme of the film, which is characters bringing about their own unhappiness through some of their actions by listening to some of their lesser angels, much like Farrell himself was doing, and much like Howie Ratner was doing back in Uncut Gems. Now, I don't bring up Uncut Gems just for the heck of it either, much as I like bringing up a nice Adam Sandler dramatic turn. I mean, who doesn't? But I bring it up because Passover is actually a big theme in that film. That movie is directed by two Jewish brothers named Josh and Benny Safdie, and they kind of thread Passover throughout the movie. Characters are waiting for Passover, they're wishing each other a happy Passover. Everyone is talking about, in Sandler's family, about what they're going to do for the Seder. And at one moment, pretty late in the film, Sandler sits down at the Seder with his extended family, and as is customary at the Seder, everyone is going around the room reading the Haggadah, reading stories about the plagues and the Exodus. And when they get to that point in the Haggadah where the plagues are ticked off, or all 10 plagues are mentioned, the patriarch of the family, played by Judd Hirsch, calls on Sandler and says, "Why don't you read the plagues?" And of course, there's a nice little kind of hint in that moment to Sandler himself, who seems to have plague upon plague befalling him. And he starts to proceed through the plagues, starting with blood and going all the way to the slaying of the firstborn. And again, we feel as viewers like, okay, this is Howie Ratner, this is Sandler's character, not simply saying the plagues because he's at a Seder and he feels like saying them, but he starts to have the awareness, we certainly have the awareness that the plagues are befalling him and he may be a little bit responsible for this affliction. Now, at the end of the plagues, when he gets to the slaying of the firstborn, he turns to his son, to his eldest son, and he says, hey, slaying of the firstborn is pretty hardcore. It can happen again if you don't watch yourself. Now, he's just joking around with his kid. He's ribbing him, or if you will, ribbiting him. But I had to do it. But what he's doing is saying to his son something very serious, which is, hey, if you're not careful, if you don't watch yourself, or really if you don't listen to yourself or the voices you should be listening to, you're going to bring some pretty serious plagues upon you. And I think he's starting to get that realization that he's not being very wise. He's not listening to the right voices. He's listening to the sorcerers who are telling him to do the wrong thing. And I think that all kind of brings together the point that I've always thought is really interesting about the plagues, which is it's not some spectacular historical event meant to distinguish a chosen people from a non-chosen people. Maybe it is. I'll leave that for others to decide what the sociological or even philosophical import of it is. But I think what it is telling us, what the plagues are coming to tell us, is a more humanist point, which is that if we don't listen to the right people in our lives, if we don't listen to the counsel that we should be seeking out, we will bring bad events upon ourselves. We will do what Howie Ratner did, what Farrow did, and what some of the characters in Magnolia were doing, which is simply not to pay attention to the advice that they should have been giving themselves or should have been tuned into. And that if we don't do that, and if we think we're kind of acting out of our own self-interest, but we're not actually paying attention to what's right for us, we're going to bring plague after plague, eventually culminating in a rather disastrous consequence. And I think that message, to me, that humanist message, is something that we can learn from the Exodus story, we can learn from Magnolia, and most of all, we can learn it from the great text that is Uncut Gems.